I thought I'd start with just what is alive in you today?
What is alive in me today? Well, right now in this moment, what's alive in me is this is very weird for me. It feels very strange to be on this side of the camera, let alone being on camera, let alone talking about myself. So today feels a bit odd. But I've decided to embrace it. I think this is an opportunity to give people an idea of who I am. A lot of people have asked me, would I be willing to put myself out there in a way like this? So what am I feeling at the moment? Nervous. I don't know what I'm going to say. But I do know I'm going to be honest with you. And I'm going to be as honest with you as I would be with anybody in a session. So I'm coming from that place. That's where I'm feeling right now. I'm excited. Strangely excited.
Brilliant. I can feel that. Brilliant. So maybe just on the back of what you've just said,
Yes.
why are you willing to share a little bit more of an intimate space, which is really for all of us sometimes a bit challenging, but why now?
You know, as you know, my mom passed at the end of this month. It'll be 5 years ago. And up until that point, I don't want to say that I was selfish, but I wasn't in the space that I'm in now. Her passing had a huge impact on me. For the last 10 plus years, I've been a director and an acting coach. I've been a life coach. I've been a facilitator. I've been a trainer. I've been doing all of that for a very long time. And was quite happy to not be in the public eye while I was doing it. But her passing impacted me in such a profound way. It opened up my own vulnerabilities. And I have noticed in the last 5 years my style has changed. So how I approach the work, how I approach my clients, how I approach my students has changed. I'm really only interested in authentic connection. Whether that is working with an actor, finding their authenticity, or working with what I lovingly call non-actors, I call them civilians. So whether I'm working with my civilian clients, this is an opportunity for me to, I think, create more rapport, actually, with the potential people who are thinking about coaching. I think to try and find a coach is a problem. I don't think it's that easy to do. I know it's an inundated industry. And I think people want to get a sense of who's who in the zoo. So today is also an opportunity for me to tell some of my stories, which I'm hoping will be another avenue for people to relate through. Yeah.
Awesome. You mentioned now the authentic connection, and it was also one of the questions that a few of us have had around how or what do you think it is that allows you beyond your formal training to bring that insight and intuition and to connect with so many different people from different walks of life? Where does that come from?
It's such a tricky question because I'm not too sure how to answer it.
Awesome.
My mum, because I mentioned her a moment ago, my mum's nickname for me when I was pre-teen was my little old man. She used to call me my little old man because she always said that I had these little nuggets of wisdom, and I was always so curious, and I was always asking adults difficult questions, and that's always been in me. And I suppose the intuitive part of me is the part that I'm always using, whether I'm directing, whether I'm facilitating, whether I'm in a private one-on-one session. There's something about, and I've always had it, this is why it's hard to try and articulate it, some sort of skill or ability to read the energy of the people who I'm working with, to feel their subtext, to understand where they're coming from. And actually, over the last number of years, the one thing that I've realized is I think that all comes from my own experience. I think it comes partly, not just intuition, but partly from my own trauma, the things that I've lived through, the difficulties that I've had since childhood. I've always been a hypersensitive person. I've always been sensitive. I was always an emotional creature. So I lived in the world open-hearted, wanting to connect with all and sundry. And life being what it is, it teaches you that no, not everyone has the same heart as you. And I've had some difficult times in my life. That started primarily within my family unit. You know, it started with what people now understand, and these words are bandied around a lot. Narcissistic personality disorders. These are the words that people use these days. Once upon a time, we didn't use those words. You just thought a person was being mean and cruel and difficult.
Right.
But actually, those framed me. Those experiences that I've had, especially being a sensitive little boy. The sensitive little boy didn't know that his love was not enough. He didn't know that by wanting to connect with others, that they didn't automatically want to connect back. That was a very difficult lesson for me, and it's come up throughout my life, that not everyone has the same integrity as you. I've completely forgotten your question.
No, that's more than, just more than. And I think it's gone down a really a cool path, because as you were speaking, I was just in my own mind thinking about therapy.
Yes.
And one of the things that I think has stood out for me is just being able to connect with someone in a session who I know holds all the credibility, but who actually sees me in the mud, and brings the layer of, like you say, intuition from your own experiences, your emotional landscape. And certainly for me, that's been such a safe place to unravel.
Yes.
And if I, and it's not even comparable, but I think in therapy, there is a very almost staged process. And I'm not discrediting that. But I think that's also where sometimes people struggle. And yeah, so what you've just articulated, I think, speaks very much to that.
Well, thank you for raising that. I think it's my opportunity to say that for anybody who's watching this and who's considering coaching, they must know I am not a licensed clinician. I'm not a psychologist. I'm not a therapist. Although everyone I work with would argue that with me. But I've often said to people when they come for sessions that this is not therapy. It will feel like therapy, but it isn't. And nothing against therapists, nothing against psychologists at all. I've had a few in my lifetime. But I found I was not getting results fast enough. I found that I wasn't being called to action in myself fast enough. I'm not a psychologist, but I could relate to pretty much every single person, and this might sound strange, but there's very little I don't relate to. Very little. To the point that some of my students and clients have been quite surprised. I know a lot of people make assumptions, based on appearance, but whether it is a person who has struggled with addiction, or people in their lives who are affecting them because of addiction, or abuse of any sort, physical, mental, emotional, spiritual abuse, narcissism, narcissistic abuse, all forms of it, parental, sibling, professional, acquaintance, romantic, didn't really matter. I'm able to understand every person that I'm working with on that level. I hope I'm making sense.
Always.
Okay.
Always.
Because it is an odd thing. It's an odd thing, and partly I'm doing this video to let people know that actually they're not alone. They're actually not alone. Once I was going through some forms of hell, I know what it feels like. You think you are alone. You really do. You believe it. You think nobody else has experienced this kind of depth and pain and agony. And such is the nature of grief, I suppose. It does make us become quite self-centered in an odd way. I suppose it should. But I seem to have, ever since I was younger, I seem to have a knack for holding space for that. Which is partly why I became a theatre director, which is partly why I became an acting coach, because I'm not afraid of intense emotion. Yes. And if anything, if you've worked with me, you know that.
Indeed.
And I can be quite pushy. because I'm not afraid of it, and I can be quite confrontational because I know the benefit that comes after confronting your fear, after confronting your, shall we call it, your limiting belief, perhaps in that moment. But there is something that quite amazing happens once you learn to make room for your pain. This also comes up in the trading and the coaching as well. You know, your history, your childhood frames your entire life. Right. So what you don't process in your childhood is going to come up all the time. And that's going to frame how you engage everything. That was a hard lesson for me. I've had some horrendous relationships. I've had some very destructive relations. I think a lot of people have. And mine don't make me any more special than anybody else. But one thing I did learn is why. And why was I attracting this into my life? And what was it in me that was being so drawn to that? It was only less than 10 years ago that the language of narcissism, etc., has been used commonly. But that was always there. And for those who are not really aware of it, you know, narcissistic types have a tendency of looking for empathic types. They like people who are going to give them love, support, benefit of the doubt. And that has been most of my life. And it started in my primary family. It started actually with my late father. Without quite knowing it, but it's taken many years for me to understand this, that he was actually a narcissist. Which makes complete sense to me because I remember what his parents were like. Without going into the how is a narcissist made. But I understand now, all these years later, why he behaved the way he did. But by that stage, the damage is done.
Right.
So intellectually I could understand, but I've had to work through physically as well, because we carry trauma. You know, trauma is not a concept. Trauma is in your body. It's something that you're still holding, which is partly something else, by the way, that I work with the people that I train, is to make room for that. You know, that your emotion is not the enemy. Sometimes your emotion is trying to get your attention to say, can we work on this? It doesn't necessarily mean something's bad or wrong. Of course, I didn't know that. I carried a lot of this traumatic energy in myself for many, many years. And if you knew me in my teens into my 20s, I was quite an angry individual. Constantly in black. And not warm to a lot of people, which I sort of regret as I look back, because I think that was a couple of years lost. But I also know why I was doing it. I was in a lot of pain. I was very upset, and I didn't feel that I had a connection. So instead of realizing, oh, I could speak about this, I could connect with people, I could heal it this way, I went into the defensive, the angry, the walls up. And I was there for many, many years, well into my 20s. My parents' divorce had a severe effect on me. My parents divorced when I was in matric, which is grade 12. And that, if I go back now, but it was just around that time as well that my mother got stomach cancer. You know, years later we used to say it's because she couldn't stomach her relationship, her marriage to my father. You know, they were married for about 25, 28 years. And their divorce was messy. And if he could have, he would have liked to have seen us on the street. He would have liked to have seen us punished. But of course you don't realize at the time, oh, this is a narcissist. This is what they do. You know, they want to punish everybody because that's what you're dealing with. You're dealing with a punishing force, not an understanding, empathic, wise one. You're dealing with a big baby in an adult body. And you just don't know that. You just think, oh, this person's just being mean and cruel. You don't understand you're dealing with a pathology. Their divorce and my mother's stomach cancer, and then the recovery of the stomach cancer, and then she had respiratory failure when she was in the hospital. So they almost lost her. I think it now, going back, if I remember, about twice, they almost lost her in the hospital. Around that time, my sister, who we understand now was misdiagnosed, But my sister went through years and years of what they were at the time calling temporal lobe epilepsy, bipolar disorder, depression. So my sister went through a different kind of hell, FYI, also caused by my father. And his abandonment within the family, that triggered my sister quite severely. I mean, in no chronological order, I'm just telling you my story.
Thank you for sharing that. That's, you know, and I think a lot of people will be able to relate to that.
Yeah.
It's almost like when we talk about love, it's not exclusive from pain
No.
and our journey there. So on that note, I mean, you've said so many beautiful things, and I don't even know where to go with my next question. Yeah. But maybe, you know, just listening to you now, there was a question that I had around, you know, everything that you've learned and gathered over the years, approaching a new relationship with someone, how do you maintain the essence of who you are?
It's a great question. It took me a long time to understand the importance of doing that. I, for many years, was not practicing my independence. Or my interdependence. I was practicing my codependency without realizing it and calling it love. Calling that sense of need for another person love, which of course it isn't. It's trauma.
Yes.
And it's an abandonment of yourself, but you don't realize that that's actually what you're doing. So I've had to go through several forms of that to realize that was up to me. I couldn't blame who I was engaging with. I was the common denominator. So to answer your question, I had to work on my self-esteem. I believe all roads lead back to self-esteem and self-worth eventually. The importance of never needing another human being. You could want to be with somebody, but to need them is a dangerous game.
Yeah.
You're making another person responsible for your well-being. I grew up watching why that doesn't work. And I've seen it countless times as to why that doesn't work. To enter any kind of relationship, professional, romantic, it doesn't matter. To maintain your sense of boundary and to maintain your sense of separateness to another person is actually quite healthy to do. But to get there, you have to learn who and what you are. You have to fall in love with yourself. You have to fall in love with your own design. And never make another person responsible for that. And never make another person responsible for validating that in you. Especially in this day and age, because we're surrounded by abusive people and they would love you to want them to validate you. That's how they get you. I think it's an extra important point in this day and age to practice your independence. To practice your emotional independence. I know it's difficult. It isn't easy. Especially because that wasn't our conditioning. You know, there's a joke that I have with my groups of actors often when I start workshops with them, as you know, is, you know, Disney effed us up. It gave us false expectations. You know, and as a child, you were watching all of that and you're thinking, oh, okay, so that's how life works. You know, you're going to fall in love and happy ending, etc. And to internalize that can be quite hard.
Yeah.
To get to a stage of realizing, oh, maybe what I've been hoping for, dreaming for, doing isn't actually earth appropriate. It's fantastical, but it isn't earth. Earth is hard. Earth school, as I like to call it, because it is. It is a school. And we're always learning. And sometimes I think we only learn through pain. The best lessons we learn are going to be through pain. It's one of the things I find as a coach that I'm quite passionate about, which is, well, what has your pain taught you? You don't have to grieve your story. You don't have to grieve the things that have happened, which is where most people get locked in, upset about the story, hanging up about the story, but not about, okay, but what did the story produce in you? And how can you work with that? Get off the narrative and get onto the action of changing. That part is what I think is Earth. That is what I think Earth is for. We come to confront each other. a huge part of how I work with people is actually quite spiritual as well. I've found that my own spiritual practices, and I mean spiritual and not religious, my work is heavily spiritually based. I draw from spiritual practices, metaphysics. Yes, an enormous amount of psychology, because I've always been fascinated by psychology. Although I didn't study it as a subject, I've studied it. I'm quite passionate about human beings, what makes human beings human beings. It was a big reason I became a director and an acting coach, because I'm fascinated by what makes humans humans. And I think holding all of that in my life was my own experience. I think that was the thing that was making me so curious, because I couldn't understand my own emotions. I couldn't understand my own upsets. Studying human beings was another way of me studying myself. And I have found shifts and changes, and that's what I've taken into my work with everyone else that I work with, to try and help them find their transitions, their changes, through a sense of, no, not the word I want, to help people find their alignment with themselves. It's a process, but I think one that you have to only go through after you've had some pain in your life. I feel very, very lucky that I work with people who share some of the most intense, devastating life truths that they've been through. Some people come and see me and tell me information that nobody else knows. To me, it's an incredible privilege, but I also know that they're doing it because they need help with it. People don't need to carry their tragedies, but they need to learn how to be transformed by their tragedies. I am not perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but I am going to be the first person who owns his crap. If I have done a mistake, I'm the first person to own up to it. If I have hurt another individual, I'm the first person to take responsibility for it. I practice what I preach. I think it's especially important in this day and age to practice integrity. To practice integrity, to practice empathy, to practice compassion, because these are things that, I'll be broad and say, narcissistic individuals do not do.
Tell us about some of your other passions in life.
You mean when I've got the time?
Yes, between 2 and 4 in the morning.
It's a bit tough because I turned my passion into my career. I turned my, what some might have looked at as a sort of hobby, into my passion, into my full-time career. Theatre, performance, reading, film. Outside of that, I suppose, cooking and gardening. But really, I turned all my passions into my career. I didn't know what else to do with them. And also, I suppose, growing up and realizing, you've got to participate in the world, go out and work, etc. I never quite found a space where I slotted in. I never quite found a space where what I am, what I do, what I offer was aligned with them. Institutions, whatever. Yeah. So I decided to go off on my own direction. And that was in my late 20s. I already knew I'm not finding a space for me. I'm going to have to create my own. And hence Indigo View. That's why I started my own company. So Indigo View is my passion. Indigo View is my life passion. I'm trying to find other words than passion. It is my...
Looks like joy.
It is my joy. It really is. My joy is working with individuals who have their own individual breakthroughs. Sometimes that's in a public space. Sometimes it's here with me. Doesn't matter. The breakthrough to me is the whole point. And I also quite enjoy doing my own thing because I'm answerable to myself. And I have to be honest, my approach is unconventional. It often is. I am not a psychologist in this way either. I will tell you my opinion. I will give you feedback. I will give you my honesty. People don't come to me knowing that I'm going to placate them. I've never been that person. I suppose I didn't really feel that I had the emotional luxury of doing such a thing. Growing up, life was hard. I suppose in all appearances, life looked quite, to outsiders, life looked as if the Feinstein family was quite happy. The Feinstein family was quite traumatized. And up until my parents' divorce, the home felt very tense.
Yeah.
Very, very tense. That tension for me was most of the time. In other words, I was too busy dealing with reality and confrontation and conflict and forms of trauma to practice being fake or placating or sweet. These are not tones that I use because it wasn't my experience. I'm always going to be empathic and caring and considerate, but I'm not going to lie. I can't stand a liar. I grew up with them. I don't need to encourage that in myself. In fact, I actively work on conscious communication. I practice what I teach, which is live transparently, live with integrity, tell people your stories, stop hiding your stories from other people. They don't care anyway, and it's hurting you. What has to happen is confronting self. I was put into a situation growing up where it felt as if I didn't really have an option. I had to confront myself, otherwise I was going to implode. I had to find skills of survival. I had to find ways of keeping my spirit positive and optimistic and forward moving. And that was not easy. Once my mom got cancer, and you don't realize at the time why, but my father, being the narcissist he was at the time, you don't know this, but narcissists really can't handle people who get sick around them, by the way. Because they have to live in a perfection world. You know, they can't deal with anything that looks remotely real or ill. Because they don't have the capacity to deal with that. So when my mom got ill, my father did a cruise change. I still remember coming home one day and my parents were fighting. My mother had just gotten out the hospital. She was this thin. She had stomach cancer, so she had 90% of her stomach removed. She had lost an incredible amount of weight. She was so weak she could barely walk. And I remember coming home and standing in my parents' room because they were fighting, because my father was fighting with her. And I can vaguely remember statements like, life will be like this. He was demanding how things would go. And I was standing there, all of about, I think 17, 18 at the time, and what the hell is wrong with you? The woman has just come out of hospital. She can't move. She can't breathe. We've got to pick her up and out of the bath. You now are having the... it was just the most bizarre... and there were so many. I mean, this is just one story that comes to mind. But there was just so many events like that where you realize, okay, this individual hasn't got love to give. It's not there. But you don't realize it. You think that they do have love to give and they're intentionally holding it back from you. That's not the case. But they would love you to think that they have love to give. They would love you to think that. That's kind of how they maintain their harem. I still don't know what your question was. I'm completely off the question.
You answered it.
Okay.
Totally.
Okay.
Nailed it. What was one of the toughest decisions you've had to make for yourself?
I've had a few. I think one of the toughest that I've had to make was to walk away from toxic relationships. That's the one that comes up the strongest in me. But believe it or not, I think it began with my father, in the sense of who was the first man in my life I learned to walk away from. Out of pure survival, out of pure necessity, out of realizing that this human, and I use that term broadly, is committed to not connecting with you. For any number of reasons. My father had a problem with my being gay, well, being so openly gay. And I never actually sat him down when I was about 13, 14, when I officially came out, to actually tell him. Because in my mind, if I came out to you, it's because you mattered to me. There was a reason I wanted to tell you. There was a reason I wanted to deepen our connection. There was no connection with him. And I used to say that he was an amazing provider, and he really, really was. He was an incredible provider. But he failed at human. He failed at parenting. He failed at present dad. And that was I had to learn to walk away from him whilst he was still in the house, if that makes sense. He told me many years later, once I had grown up and became more verbal and vocal and more confrontational, he told me once that we were having a fight in a public restaurant once because of how he was treating my sister, who was going through her dark night of the soul journey, which, by the way, took 10 years. 10 years of her dark night. And my father and brother, nowhere to be seen, nowhere to be found, living their independent lives. And it was just me, my mom, and my sister. That was the primary unit. We looked after each other. But my mom and I would tag team and look after my sister, who went through many years of suicidal ideation, etc. So my sister wanted to exit, and my mother and I looked to each other. You know, yes, mom and I were mom and son, but we were best friends, we were allies. We went through literal hell together. Not just her cancer, but my father's emotionally absent behavior. That causes an enormous amount of hurt and damage in people. An enormous amount. And I did not realize that I was attracted to what resembled that. So I have fallen for very toxic people. People who did not have love to give. But, of course, what I know now and what I've learned is it's the familiarity that you're attracted to. It's the sense of knowing, even though you might know intellectually this is quite bad for me. But emotionally it feels warm and cozy and safe. Of course it isn't. It's just familiar agony. So I've had to learn to walk away a number of times. And every single time it was different, but yet remarkably similar. The individuals were different, but the experience of, oh hell, I can't believe I'm here again. Oh crap, this has happened again. What do you mean you've been lying to me this whole time? The sense of not really knowing who you were with. All of that, you know, I've had to learn that many times. And I speak about this as a gay guy. You know, this is true for everybody. You know, straight, gay, bi, doesn't actually matter. You know, women are just as narcissistic as men. But I can speak dominantly about gay men as well, because that's my arena. Mental health in the gay world is frighteningly bad. It's actually quite bad. So as a gay guy, of course, I encounter men the most, and men have their own level of damage. Not least of all gay guys. Straight men too. But yes, yeah, Linz, I've had to learn to walk away a lot. But every time you get better at it, you know, and every time you realize, okay, I'm not really walking away from you as much as I'm walking towards myself. And that's something I had to realize. I had to go, okay, it's not love. I haven't lost the love of my life. That was not what this was. But I was tricked into thinking that. It's tough. It's a tough thing. You know, some of the best, most educated people in the world still get duped. You know, you can know as much as you know about the subject. Depending on the individual you're dealing with. These are master manipulators. These are deeply, deeply cunning people. And it's not even fully conscious. They're doing it subconscious. They've been doing it since they were little. They are master, I've often called them dark method actors. Because they go into the real world believing their own nonsense. Believing their own fakery. They have to. Otherwise, if they didn't, you wouldn't believe it. So you walk away from ultimately realizing you walked away from something that wasn't even there. And that's a strange thing. That's a strange thing to live through.
And again, it's facing the realities of a past or a childhood, and it's now manifesting in front of you in a romantic relationship or in a career. As you were speaking, I was just thinking about, and also at the risk of sounding binary, but specifically, what is the toxic conditioning that you find in your sessions that men are affected by today?
Quite a few things. I think what keeps contributing to this toxic conditioning is our societal refusal to practice empathy and vulnerability and compassion. In other words, we are living in an era of narcissism. That is the age and time that we are living in. I think we've always had narcissists. As long as human beings have been on the planet, we've always had them. But this day and age, I think things are getting a lot worse. Social media contributes to it. In fact, I think most social media is pretty toxic. Don't get me started on Instagram. Men have become encouraged to disconnect from their soul and to become image obsessed and to concern themselves and pour all their energy into where they live, what they drive, whoever is on their arm. But I call them Easter eggs because they're very sparkly, but if you actually knock on it, it's quite hollow. There's no substance. And our society is encouraging that. Our society encourages a removal of depth. We are also living in an age, I think, where we are shaming people who come with depth, who come with alternative points of view. I suppose, we're also living in an age of wokedom, as people like to call it, which I think is just the same problem from another angle. It's just another extreme. It's just another form of dismissal. It's just another way of practicing not listening. Not just men, but of course, we were talking about men. Human beings in this day and age are, I think, it's a fascinating time to be alive, but I think it's a very challenging time to be alive. To practice connection to your spirit, to your integrity, to your heart space, your ability to make room for another human being, whatever that might mean. These are skills that have to be taught from young. And unfortunately, people are having children, damaged people are having children. And damaged people don't know how to parent. And damaged people who don't know how to parent don't know how to teach little boys and little girls about empathy, about cause and effect, about your behavior, how that has an impact on the people around you, etc., etc., etc. These are things that have to be taught from a young age. And then, of course, people don't develop these skills. Then they grow up and they take all of their non-development into the world, and then we wonder why things are as they are. And you can see it in almost every walk of life, can't you? You can see it in the performing arts, you can see it in politics, you can see it in religious institutions, it's everywhere. Humans are consumed with wanting power and status at any cost. It's my opinion, and take it or leave it, but I kind of think that's the secret test of Earth. You're going to come to this planet and you're going to be distracted by a lot. And you are going to think that what you see, taste, touch is all that there is. And if that is how you live in this world, in other words, you have no relationship to the abstract, the symbolic, the emotional, the unseen. If you live in a literal way, you are dangerous. You are dangerous. And that's something that I've been seeing more and more of these days. Men are guilty of it because our culture encourages it. And I'm yet to meet a man who pursues such, shall we call them worldly things, who was happy. Never met that. Never. And I trust that. I trust that shallow pursuits produce shallow feelings. It's a pattern. But you're right. I think men are, in this day and age, are more terrified of breaking through their barriers. Because it does mean change. And it does mean that they are going to have to leave certain people behind in their lives. And they are going to have to stand up for themselves. But, you know, as we said, all roads lead back to self-worth and self-esteem. Yeah.
I was just thinking, again, as you were speaking, how do we help one another? I mean, I was going to say men, but it's for all of us, you know, as whether that's in the capacity as a wife, a girlfriend, a friend, a colleague. How do we hold space for that? Or, you know, in your mind, what are some of the things that we can do there?
I move between two spaces on this topic. I think on the one hand, you have to be quite realistic in the sense that there are some people that are so damaged they're beyond help. Unfortunately.
Gotcha.
I wish that wasn't the case. I really do. Sometimes with some people when they come for sessions and they are still holding on to what is often referred to as malignant hope. That the people in their lives are still going to change. That they're suddenly going to alert themselves or wake up to a sense of accountability and responsibility all of a sudden. And it never happens. And that is on the one hand. And that's quite a difficult thing to accept. It's deeply disappointing and soul-crushing depending on where you're coming from. And on the flip side of that, I still think there are some people who are on the spectrum but can still work on themselves. You know, we're all on the spectrum. Narcissism, codependency, we're all on that spectrum. Of course, I'm talking about the extreme side. You know, I'm talking about the malignant, toxic types, you know, who are beyond help. But there are some who practice some self-awareness. And those people can bring some sort of change. I think it is possible. But living on Earth means grey area. It's a grey area. I know it's not a popular thought. People like to live in extremes, which, by the way, I think is another quality of our time, talionic thinking. All abusive people, by the way, use talionic thinking. Everything is black or white. Life is actually grey. So what we're talking about here is a very grey area. And I think it's subjective. I think it's individual. I think it does come down to a person, to a dynamic. And that's where you've got to, and I'm sorry that I have to say it like this, but I think we have to enter all relationships with a level of mistrust until someone has proven to you that you are safe with them. And the hard thing there, you know, having lived it myself in terms of my own family, are you ready to close the door?
Yeah.
This isn't about hurting other people. This isn't about trying to abuse the abuser. This is about self-respect. This is about self-preservation. To close the door on them, so to speak, is very difficult. It's actually called going no contact. That's its actual name. And that is difficult, especially if you still maintain some sort of hope and optimism. But often people are not engaging with each other realistically. They're engaging with their idea of each other. It's a challenge because every coupling is going to be a possible toxic situation. Sad but true. You can't just trust everybody these days. Again, it's a Disney idea.
What impresses you, Steve?
What impresses me? Oh, wow. Lots of stuff. Transparency, boldness, open communication, willing to share stories, willingness to connect with something that's beyond your framework, curiosity to learn, openness to change, emotional courage and bravery, especially when I'm working with actors in that domain. You know, the thing that always impresses me is a human being who's put their ego aside and has made something more meaningful their goal. People who understand the difference between ego and meaning always impress me. And perhaps more than impress, that word sounds as if I'm trying to pass judgment. They inspire and illuminate. Yeah.
Lovely. What qualities are you most proud of sitting here today within yourself?
That's a great question. That I've still maintained empathy and compassion in myself. When it was bullied and literally battered, physically thrown around, emotionally neglected, spiritually ostracized. That. The fact that, and I can be hard, I can be tough, because this is the world we live in. And I'm not afraid of confronting a person. I grew up in a very hostile space and I've got a very thick skin. So, you learn to survive. But I'm proud that I still maintain some sense of, now you're going to move me, Linz. I see you moved. But yes, it has. And I think that keeping this available. Not always, because that's been a tough lesson. Be picky about when you open it. But the fact that I've still have me, I suppose. It is a weird way of putting it. But that I still have myself.
Yeah.
That's something I'm proud of. It's something that I try to impart with people that I work with, because there's a privilege in the space that I have. Because I'm often encountering people who are not, shall we say, in the best form of themselves yet. They're not in their optimal self.
Yeah.
So for me, it's the most profound thing, working with people who transform themselves and they step into that. And I think that's where I'm coming from in those moments. It's that I know what it is to feel like you have nothing left. And that you yourself feel as if you are not enough. Because the people around you, who should be your primary caretakers, who should be the people that you trust, are making you falsely believe that something is often wrong with you. That's something else that I'm proud of, that I can tell bullshit.
Yeah.
And that's something I try and teach everyone that I work with, is learn to find your voice. You have to find your voice, because there are people who are benefiting from you not speaking up. And anyone who is on your side would never benefit from that. Anyone who's really, really on your side is going to encourage your individuality, not be threatened by it. And I'm proud that I've maintained a sense of self. But I think that also has a lot to do with my mom. If you knew my mom was a tough cookie. And she did not suffer fools. And she was fiercely protective over the people she loved. And I think I picked up so much of that from her. But as I say, I think her passing in the last 5 years has cracked me open. It's cracked a lot of things open to myself, and I'm grateful for it, because as scary and as sad and as difficult as the grief has been, it has changed me.
And I think it sort of relates to my next question, which is, what is it within you? And I know that you've been to those dark places, and it's one of the things that I think provides safety for other people when they come with their dark spaces. But what is it that kept you grasping at life in your darkest hour?
I think knowing that whatever form of hell I was experiencing at that time was not all that there is. Sometimes when I'm working with people, I'd call it faith. I really do. I think there's a level of faith that you find that you find and you summon up when you feel as if there's nothing left. To me, I've always called that a spiritual moment. I think it is a spiritual purpose. I think we partly come to earth to get brought to our knees, to tell you the truth, to shatter, to be broken down so that you can build yourself up again. I'm a huge fan of that Jungian quote who said, I might paraphrase this, that your life starts at 40, the first half is research. I've always loved that.
Brilliant.
And I think there's a lot of truth to that. You know, I think you go through a lot of hardship and a lot of difficulty, not because you're being punished at all, but that you're being invited to change. And human beings, you know, we fight change tooth and nail, and yet it's so strange, isn't it, that it's the one inevitable. We all will have change, whether we like it or not. Everything ends. Everything ends. And I take solace in that. And I know that even the worst moments end. They just feel, when they're happening, they just don't feel that way. You know, but that's the lie created by your ego, making you falsely believe that everything that's happening now is you, and you are damned, and oh God, and how terrible. And no, it's actually not the case. Hope, faith, and self-trust, I think. I'm not saying that that's smooth sailing. Not at all. But to learn to look to yourself more than you look to another person. That was every single time, no matter what the hardship was that I was experiencing. That was the common theme. That was the thread. Practice your independence now, Steve, not your codependence. That was the message all the time. And I try and impart that, you know, whether I'm working with a non-actor or an actor. To me, it doesn't matter. You're still a human being. You might just take the skill into a different direction for yourself, but actually, at the end of the day, who are you to yourself? I think that's key.
Would you mind telling us about your oldest and scariest demon?
Wow. Oldest and most scariest demon. The first word that comes to mind would be insecurity. I think it's the very, very, very first thing that comes to mind. Growing up, receiving unconditional love from one parent and then receiving very conditional love from the other one is not great for your self-esteem. It's really not. And without realizing it, you become a people pleaser. You become somebody who's exerting all of your energy into maintaining calm or kind or something in somebody else. And that created demons. That created a lot of demons. The idea that you can somehow make another person happy is complete illusion. But it comes from a codependent belief as well, that God knows is encouraged by the narcissist to put it there. So, yes, absolutely, I would say insecurities. And of course, they come up all the time. But I must say, part of the coaching, part of the process itself is about make room for that. Make room for that. You know, we're not going to be perfect. As human beings, insecurity is part of the human experience. So don't go to war with yourself about it. And I really did. You know, I really did. I think that was also part of my teens and my 20s, that dark stage of life. Was all motivated by an insecurity of some kind. You know, fear of not being enough. Or concern with not being seen as valuable. Or professional. It doesn't matter what it was. I had to realize, and it was quite a horrible journey, because it literally brought me to my knees. It literally brought me to my knees. I was in the middle of watching a production, and I passed out. They had to stop the show.
Good grief.
And call an ambulance to check if I was okay.
Oh my God.
I know, it's terrible. And that was where my people-pleasing took me. To the point of complete self-abandonment. It was in my late 20s, and that's when I realized, this is not working. So those demons don't go away. You know, they come up and going, are you sure you don't want to listen to me?
Totally.
Yeah.
So you just mentioned a big one, self-abandonment.
Yeah.
What are the most prevalent, and I call them disabling themes that you are confronted?
Disabling themes.
Yeah, themes that
Yes.
you are confronted with the most in your coaching sessions.
Limiting self-belief. The idea that one is somehow lacking in some way, shape, or form, and that feeling of lack is taken as truth or fact.
Yeah.
This is something I'm seeing in pretty much every single person I work with. Yeah, to varying degrees, to varying intensities, but the theme of the self,
Yeah.
the self. So much just leads off of that, doesn't it? Whether it's self-affection, whether it's self-kindness, these are things that also we're not really encouraging us, and our society almost makes you think that you're being narcissistic or arrogant or something if you are prioritizing yourself. So in the work that I do, by the time people come and see me, they're often almost divorced from themselves by that stage.
I mean, people approaching you for coaching, have there been times where you were actually unable to assist someone?
Yes, thank you for asking that. There are some skills I do not have. If a person is dealing with severe addiction, I am not their coach. There are others who have phenomenal skills, and might I add patience for those kinds of challenges. Having gone through addiction myself, I'm quite intolerant.
Okay.
So I've closed the chapter of that in my life. To coach and work with that is the area that I do feel intuitively we wouldn't be a good fit. However, if you are working on or affected by, in other areas of your life, relationship-wise, professional, other areas, as I'm saying this, Linz, I'm thinking, pretty much everything except addiction. If you are an addict, please go and see somebody who knows how to deal with that. And I have had moments in my career where I think we've gone as far as my skill set goes, and then I would say, I think it might be time for you to go and see somebody else. Yes, so it does happen. As much as we're going to have a friendship, a relationship, a bond, etc., because I get to know who I'm working with at a deeply personal level. We will laugh, we will cry, we will go through the gamut of emotion. We absolutely will. And if you're not prepared to do that, then I'm not your fit.
Brilliant. What makes life meaningful to you?
Always being present. Being in the moment. Even now, as I'm saying this to you, I'm looking at the tree outside. Being present with what is. When you're practicing presence and you're practicing accepting of that moment, everything changes. And I find everything fascinating. I find everything fascinating. I find how a person blinks interesting. You know, I find how the wind is moving the curtain interesting. To me, being present, and I suppose it came from the craft, you know, from practicing the craft and performance, etc. Performance doesn't work if you're not present.
Exactly.
And nor does life, I've found.
Why do you think we struggle so much with staying present and embracing what is?
Because we get hung up on our stories. And we think our stories are our identities. Which is, I think, partly why some individuals get somewhat addicted to their story. You know, it's sort of as if saying you can encounter a person who's gone through a terrible divorce, say, and 10 years later they're still talking about it as if it happened yesterday. You know, they speak of it with the same level of intensity and passion. And they don't quite realize it, but they've entrapped themselves.
Yeah.
And for example, you know, that's a past example where they believe their identity was tied into the story. And I think also to add to that, it's also the ego. The ego doesn't do presence. The ego will only do future obsession and past obsession. It will never do present. And human beings have a very, 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 very loud voice in their head called the ego. And that thing is leading you, if you aren't mindful, if you don't know how to talk back to it. I think people live in the past and the future because it gives them a sense of something to do.
Sure.
It gives them a sense of something to niggle on. Presence is tough because presence is already perfect. Presence is already beautiful. All you have to do is meet it, you know, and be humble, I suppose, enough to let it into. So to answer your question, why do people struggle with it? Because we also have a mental health problem across the world. And mental health people, to put that to you in another way, are deeply identified with ego. That's where they come from. That's why they cause damage. They are, because the ego is the absolute base part of being a human being.
Yeah.
The absolute base. You do not get lower than that. You know, that everything becomes about your survival. Everything becomes about what you winning over another individual or whatever the case is. Presence is quite a beautiful practice, not just because it can make you feel different, but actually it's an act of maturity, in my opinion. And we are not living in an age of maturity. We just aren't. If anything, the immature are outnumbering the mature. So I find that that's one of the key things. We all have egos, and if you don't know how to identify it in yourself, you will think that voice is you.
Yeah.
You absolutely will. And then you're engaging with other people who also in themselves think that that voice is them. And now, the mess is life. The mess is the grey area. And I lately I've been saying, I believe that there is an art to living. Not just for actors, but for everybody. I think there's an art to living.
What do you mean by that?
I think it means being able to tell the difference between shallow and meaningful. To know where to put focus and why. To learn how to listen. Really. You know, there's a thing that all actors, all great actors know, is that listening is everything. You know, the ability to make another person interesting to you, to the point that you let them affect you, is an art form. And you can take that art form into life. I'm just saying, pick very carefully who you do that with. Because as on the stage, there are villains in the world. The art form is learn who you are. In my opinion, actors cannot be great actors unless they learn their own makeup, unless they learn who and what their design is, because it's all they have. You know, an actor only has themselves to draw from when they're playing a character. I think a human being has the same process available to them. You don't have to engage people with the idea of what you think they want from you. You can engage people with the idea of you want for yourself.
Yeah.
That's an art form to me. When I work with actors, I say, please don't mirror each other. An audience doesn't want to watch two or more actors in a scene who are similar. We want to watch your contrast. We want to watch your conflict. We want to watch your separateness. And I think that builds a resilience. I think that builds a capacity to be okay with being disagreed with or whatever. And to take that into the world, I think is a remarkable skill. You don't have to be an actor to practice it. But I think what actors learn, everybody can benefit from. Everybody.
One final
Yes.
one final contemplation, and it's really just to ask you for your final nuggets for anyone who is willing to go on this journey with you. What is it that you want to say?
If you want to go on this journey with me, know that we are going to get our hands dirty, that I am on your side, even though at times it might feel like I'm not. That when I push you because I see all your potential, especially in those moments when I know you don't. My pushiness comes from care and affection, believe it or not. It just won't sound like it. We might not be a fit, and I might have to be honest with that. There are a lot of people and lots of different needs, and I might not have the skill set for you. So that's something people should know, that as much as they get to choose me as their coach, I've also got to choose them as my client. It is that level of equality. That this process is exactly that. It's a process. That you cannot approach it looking for immediate outcomes. This is not that kind of program. You cannot measure the human spirit. You just can't. And you have to be willing to change. This isn't a me do something to you kind of process. This is a we do it together. But ultimately you are going to be responsible for your own outcomes. You are going to be responsible for your own results. And I will hold space and walk that journey alongside you. But that I can't do it for you. And I will make you accountable for yourself. Yes, I will.
So given some of your, I know we've spoken about some of the trauma that you've been through, and there are other areas of your life where you have experienced this, it's very intense. How has that impacted your empathy for others?
I think it's where all my empathy comes from. I think having gone through shock, trauma, near-death, depression, familial disintegration, cancer, depression, addiction, narcissism, I've lived it. I've lived through these things. So when I work with individuals, all I have is my own first-hand experience. That's where I draw it from. So I empathize and I actually literally understand where people are coming from. Yes, there's a certain amount of knowledge and learning, but my knowledge and learning has come from real life. It really has. To the point where I might be in a session with a person and they pause and I know why they're pausing. And I know where they've gone.
Has it ever triggered you?
You know, I have ripples. Where, and that's kind of what I mean by intuition. Where I'm in their presence. I'm not reliving anything in myself. But the body keeps the score. The body remembers everything. You know, we really are fridge on feet. So we've stored everything in the body. So I can be in the presence of someone and it might feel like it's coming from an abstract space, but I know the integrity of the intensity they're in and why they're there. Whether it came from an outside or an inside source.
Yeah.
My experience and my style of coaching comes from what I've lived through. That's why my coaching style is so personal.
Yeah.
And it's possibly another reason why I'm not suited to become what some would call a psychologist. Because I cannot sit there while I see you going through something that I relate to and keep quiet. It's just not in me to do.
Exactly.
So I think, yeah, my empathy and my style of coaching comes from relatability. Because I really do understand where people are coming from.
Yeah.
It's a weird thing to say, but there's not a lot that I don't relate to. I know it's a strange thing to say. Directing actors taught me many years ago through trial and error to not get involved in their process. Because I saw how it doesn't work. And I used to get very nosy in what they had to do, without realizing that the more of that I was doing, the less of themselves they were actually owning. So directing taught me the importance of a boundary. Directing taught me the importance of direct, facilitate, get involved, but don't carry another person's stuff, because you can't. And that awareness, I think, was in me way before I decided to become a life coach. And I maintain that. And I think it has a lot to do with boundary. I think it has a lot to do also with the other person is what's interesting to me, not my own experience. So I might feel a similarity, but you are still my focus, not me. I think it's important when you're coaching that, yeah, there's an element of bring yourself to it, but the person you're working with is still the focus. So I might feel a little bit triggered, I might feel similarly, but the truth is, years and years and years of pushing many a person into many an emotional zone has given me the capacity to hold space and not absorb it. It's how I work, and it's not everyone's cup of tea, it can't be. There are 8 billion people on the planet. They're not all going to resonate with how I work. But those who do, I welcome them with open arms. I want to work with people who want better for themselves.
Exactly.
Those are the people that are my people. And the truth is, I have found that once people get into this process, they prefer the depth. They actually prefer it. People who believe that they've hit their limitation, that they can't go further. That's where my aggression comes out, and I don't mean that in a nasty way. I mean that in a I'm going to shock you out of your crap way.
Yeah. Yes.
It means I'm coming after you.
Yes.
Not because I want to make you feel worse, but because you are making yourself feel worse. And I am going to help you remove that thorn, but you're not going to like the process. And those are the ones that always stick out for me, because those are the ones who think that there wasn't possibility for change.
Yeah.
And then those are the ones who go through it, and they really do. They prove it to themselves. Those guys stick out for me. I don't have one. I've been so fortunate to work with hundreds of people over the last number of years. Every single person who comes to see me, I take them seriously. Because if you come to see me, you are basically telling me that you are dedicated to a process. And I take that extremely personally.
Yeah.
With every individual, that's why I want to know you as an individual. Because it's not a one-size-fits-all. It just isn't.